Okay, so we're going to talk about chapter 21, which is the lymphatic system. And this is going to be a relatively short chapter, kind of an intro into chapter 22. So we'll be referring a lot to 21 when we go over 22. So in chapter 21, we're just going to talk about what is lymphatic system, the parts of lymphatic system, and then 22, we'll be talking about how it is important in our immune system. So lymphatic system is a system that's composed of lymphatic vessels, lymphatic structures, and then lymph. So those are your three main parts of the lymphatic system. You can see on this image right here, the different vessels of the lymphatic system. Generally, we use green for lymphatic vessels and lymphatic structures. Not that they are really green, but that's just what we use on the diagrams. So you can see some vessels that are labeled. You can also see some structures on this figure that are labeled. And notice that there's a box that says primary lymphatic structures. There's also a box that says secondary lymphatic structures. So make sure when you're done with this chapter that you're able to tell me which ones are primary and which ones are secondary, and then what the difference is between them, which I will cover in a little bit. And then you see these lymphatic vessels. And among the lymphatic vessels, you can see, if you look really closely at this image, that there are these, what looks like nodules, just throughout these vessels. And these nodules are going to be your lymph node. And you can kind of see how they're clustered in different areas. And so based on the area where they're located, we also name them different things. Like you have in the armpit region, you would have the axillary lymph nodes. In the inguinal region, you would have inguinal lymph nodes and such. So I might actually come back to that picture. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit. What do I have next? I have this. So let's see if we can do this little activity here. And oh, look, they have a Valentine's Day one. So hopefully you've kind of looked at some of this already. If not, let's see if you see something from this. So I'm not gonna play because I know the answers. And it seems like we only have 2 people connected. Oh, 3 people, look. There's one other person. All right, there it is. And I'm gonna, there, I should have hit the names. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I don't know if you guys hear the sound. So if you have your textbook, hopefully you have your textbook somewhere, you can definitely look for these answers, right? Good job. I got 0 points because I didn't play. But anyway, so so the first questions were just classification of what belongs where, and the primary and secondary structures, there are only two primary things, and that's thymus and bone marrow. So if you remember those two, then all the other structures are going to be they're going to be secondary lymphatic structures. So just remember, thymus and bone marrow are primary. The last question talked about or was asking about lymph and the composition of lymph. So the lymph is fluid that fills the lymphatic vessels, and it comes from the interstitial fluid. And so on here, we see the diagram of what a lymphatic capillary would look like. And lymphatic capillaries, I've mentioned it when we talked about the capillary exchange, right? When we talked about fluid being pushed out of the blood capillary into the interstitial space, and then most of it returned back into the blood, but some of it was taken by lymphatic capillaries. And I drew them kind of a funky way, right? And the reason for that is because they look like this. So there are these blind-ended or closed-ended vessels, okay, these lymphatic capillaries. So what that means is they have ends. They're not all interconnected, but they have, I say ends, but they're kind of like beginnings, right? Because that's where the fluid is going to enter that lymphatic capillary. It's kind of like a branch of a tree, right? It's not, they're not all connected. They have ends, or in this case, beginnings. So lymphatic capillaries, that's what they look like, and they're going to be found in in most of your tissues. There are exceptions where we don't see these lymphatic capillaries, and they include red bone marrow, central nervous system, and avascular tissue, which for avascular tissue, this makes sense. If you don't have blood capillaries, you don't need lymphatic capillaries there because there's no fluid exchange that we see during capillary exchange. So this fluid is going to move from the interstitial space, is going to move into the lymphatic capillary by passive transport. And this passive transport is ensured by increase in hydrostatic pressure in the area. So go back to your capillary exchange and imagine there is that capillary exchange going on. There's fluid that's being added into the interstitial space. When that's happening, the pressure in that space increases because you're adding more fluid there. And so that increase in that pressure, it's not a huge increase in pressure, it's slight, but it's enough to push some of this fluid into these lymphatic capillaries. The anatomy of the lymphatic capillaries helps with that. So if you notice on that picture B right there, you can see that there are these spaces between these cells because these cells are overlapping. So they're not next to each other like regular endothelial cells of a blood capillary. They're actually on top of each other slightly. And so if the fluid is coming from this way, it would push one of the cells open like this, fluid goes in. But if you increase the pressure from the inside, because of that overlap, this wouldn't open. So it's this overlap ensures that fluid moves into the lymphatic capillary in one direction, but it wouldn't be able to move out. It's kind of like when you imagine how door opens, right? And you have the door frame, you can open the door in one direction, but then you can't push it backwards the other direction because the door frame is in the way, right? So that's kind of how this works as well. There's about 10 to 15% of the fluid that has been filtered out during capillary exchange that's taken up by the lymphatic capillaries. There's one other significant difference between the movement of the fluid into the lymphatic capillaries versus the blood capillaries. Blood capillary is going to be using the interstitial or intercellular clefts, and also some things are going to diffuse, but there is a selective filtration of the fluid out of the blood capillary. Not everything can pass through the blood capillary. Some things are going to remain in the blood during the capillary exchange. However, with the lymphatic capillary, because there are these overlaps and they are kind of create these large or relatively large spaces, there's really no selective movement of fluid. Anything that's in the interstitial space has the ability to move into the lymphatic capillary. And that includes, any like traces of nutrients, even though that's not really what should be happening, but anything that's in the interstitial fluid can move into the lymphatic capillary. You would see some dissolved material, you would see some foreign materials, you would see some proteins, and as well as metastasized cancer cells would be able to pass into the lymphatic capillary. And the overall purpose of the lymphatic capillary and the lymphatic system is to scan for any infection or any tissue damage. And so that's for that reason, it plays a huge role in our immune system. So if this tissue that you see in picture A, let's say that there is some bacterial infection and your cells are fighting, the bacteria, and the bacteria are dying and all that debris, all those traces, even sometimes the bacteria that maybe haven't been killed yet, have the ability to move into the lymphatic capillary. Lymph will then move through lymphatic capillaries. These will merge into larger and larger lymphatic vessels. And then they will pass through a cluster of lymph nodes. So as you saw there, those regions with clusters of lymph nodes, lymph will flow through these lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are going to be the places that scan this fluid. They scan for any traces of pathogens that are in that fluid. If they detect a pathogen, they're going to initiate an immune response. And this is going to be part of your adaptive immunity that we will talk about in chapter 22. So anyway, so we'll be talking about inflammation, and you'll, on that inflammation picture, if you come across it before I talk to you about it, actually, I might have already posted the video that talks about inflammation, but whenever you come across the picture in chapter 22 that has the inflammation, keep that in mind. That's showing you a tissue that it has an infection going on. And so you can see those cells and anything that's in there that would be able to pass into the lymphatic capillary. And then that goes into the lymph node, and then lymph node initiates that other line of defense for your body. So that's our lymph. So I've already mentioned lymphatic capillaries are going to go or are going to move fluid in a unidirectional fashion. So it goes in and then towards the larger vessels, but it doesn't move the other way around. I've mentioned the hydrostatic pressure increase that ensures that the fluid is being pushed into the lymphatic capillary. Other function, or not a function, but feature of lymphatic capillary is that the cells are not surrounded by a basement membrane. So like with the blood capillary, you had the endothelium and then you had a basement membrane surrounding that whole thing, right? But in lymphatic capillary, you don't have that basement membrane, which, that combined with the fact that the cells are overlapping means that the structure is not as solid as your blood capillary is. And so we have to make sure that this whole thing doesn't fall apart. And so there are these filaments called anchoring filaments that anchor the cells of the lymphatic capillary to the surrounding tissue so that the structure remains intact. So those are those little purple lines that you see there. So those are anchoring filaments. Let's talk a little bit about lymph flow. The lymphatic capillaries, I've already said, that are going to merge into larger vessels, and then they're eventually going to merge into trunks, and those are large lymphatic vessels, and then to ducts. These are the largest ones, and ducts are relatively short, but that's where several trunks are coming together. And then each duct will empty into a vein. So they will empty into subclavian veins. And so this fluid, the lymph that flows through the lymphatic system, remember, its origins are from the blood, right? Filters out from the blood into interstitial space. Then from the interstitial space, this fluid enters the lymphatic capillary. It passes through the lymphatic system, but ultimately it's going to return back to blood. Okay, so it's just like part of your fluid is taking a detour, but it's going to become part of blood again. It's just, we're just scanning that fluid for any traces of pathogen. Let me see if I can do this. So on here, you can see some of those trunks, and also the ducts are shown here. So you can see where the ducts are going to empty into the blood. They're emptying where the subclavian and jugular vein are meeting. So that's also a place where the ducts are going to be emptying. So the other picture here, part B, that green man right there, this shows you which areas are drained by what. So make sure that you remember this. Basically, your right lymphatic duct is only going to be draining your right upper quadrant. And when I say draining, it means that it's taking or collecting lymph from those areas. Okay, so your right lymphatic duct is only doing your upper right quadrant. The rest of your body is drained by thoracic duct. So expect a question like, select all the areas that would be drained by thoracic duct, for example. Okay, and you would be selecting which ones. Nothing of the right upper quadrant should be checked for that one, right? So if you see a leg and it says which areas are drained by right lymphatic duct, and there's a leg in your choices, that's wrong, right? Because right lymphatic duct is not going to be draining any legs or anything from the abdomen. So make sure that, sometimes students like to draw it. I've had people draw a stick figure and just make that line to remind themselves, okay, it's just that upper right quadrant that is drained by the right lymphatic duct. So I will definitely be asking you questions like that. So you need to know what is drained by what. Let's look at these trunks here. So most of the trunks have left and right side, not all of them though. So you have a jugular trunk. Jugular trunk is going to drain head and neck, and there is left and right jugular trunk. We have subclavian trunk. Subclavian trunk is, there's a right, but there's also a left that's not shown here. As we're moving lower, you have the bronchomediastinal trunk. This is going to drain the deep thoracic structures. And then intestinal trunk is going to drain structures within your abdominal cavity. And the lowest one is going to be the lumbar trunk. And for lumbar trunk, you have left and right lumbar trunks. Okay. So you can see the ones at the bottom there, you have right lumbar trunk, then intestinal is in the middle, and then left is on the left side. So the intestinal trunk is in the middle there of those. So just in general, know which one drains what, just briefly, like I just said it. So that's that. You can see the thoracic duct really well on this, and you can see that it's actually pretty large compared to the right lymphatic duct. The right lymphatic duct is a very short vessel, really, a lymphatic vessel that is a result of a merger of several different trunks there. But thoracic duct is going to run through your whole thoracic cavity from that cisterna chyli up towards the subclavian vein. The cisterna chyli is an enlarged area at the base of the thoracic duct, and the cisterna chyli, cisterna like for cisterns, so it's like a container, right? And chyli has to do with the fact that it is lipid rich, or it's rich in lipids, because the cisterna chyli is going to receive lymph from your intestinal areas or from your intestines, and these are going to be rich in lipids. We will see in the digestive system that the way that our body absorbs lipids into the blood is actually different than other nutrients. Our body packages it into these, packages the lipid into these little like protein pockets that are called chylomicrons. And so that prefix chylo has to do with lipids. So cisterna chyli refers to the fact that there's a lot of lipids in this. And we know that all this lymph is returning back to blood. So that's how lipids get into our blood. They have to go through the lymphatic system first, and then they enter our circulation. So that's for most lipids is how this works. But again, you'll see that again in the digestive system. So that's our trunks and ducts and cisterna chyli. It's chyli, not chili. I had people say chyli, chi. Yeah, anyway, so it's chyli. The CH is a K sound. All right, so that's our capillaries, ducts, vessels, and one other thing that I wanted to mention about just the lymphatic vessel anatomy in general is because we've compared the blood capillaries with the lymphatic capillaries, but the vessels, the larger vessels, are going to resemble veins, your blood veins. So you're going to see the three tunics, just like we saw in our regular veins. And you're also going to see valves. So lymphatic vessels have valves in them. And that's because lymphatic system doesn't have a pump at all. So it relies on movement of fluid just like our blood veins do. And that's the skeletal muscle pump. And then the respiratory pump is what the main drive is going to be, pushing this lymph through our lymphatic system. Okay, so that's another anatomical feature that I wanted to mention about those lymphatic vessels. Let's look at the lymphatic tissues. Okay, let's match some pairs here. Okay, so these are your pairs. So if you're logged into this, try to match the correct things together. You might want to start with I would start with the ducts, because those are I think those are the easiest, and then that goes away, right? And then you can do the trunks. All right, so you guys finished. Okay, so good job. Didn't take you too many tries, so that's good. And you can redo this. This is a good little practice for you. So if you go into the Nearpod again, you can redo that just for practice. You can skip all the other slides if you don't want to look at them, but I think it's a good little way to, you know, just practice putting them together. All right, so let's look at the lymphatic structures now. So this was, so what we've talked about was the vessels and the capillaries and the lymph. Now we're gonna look at the lymphatic structures. So lymphatic structures are divided into primary and secondary structures. The primary structures are responsible for formation and maturation of lymphocytes. Write that down and memorize that forever and ever, okay? Primary lymphatic structures are responsible for formation and maturation of lymphocytes. There are only two structures that are primary lymphatic structures, and they are your red bone marrow. And we already know that's the site of hemopoiesis. This is where formed elements, all formed elements are formed. So red bone marrow is a primary lymphatic structure. And then the other one is thymus. And thymus is not forming anything, but thymus is very important in maturation of T lymphocytes. And maturation of T lymphocytes, will actually go in detail about how that is happening in the thymus in chapter 22. So we'll come back to it. But for now, just know thymus is responsible for maturation of T lymphocytes. And for that reason, it's a primary lymphatic structure. So red bone marrow is also responsible for some maturation of certain things, like B lymphocytes. They mature in red bone marrow, but they're mainly the site of formation. And then thymus is responsible for maturation of T lymphocytes. Well, that's about it that I have about the red bone marrow. Let's look at the thymus. So that's our second primary structure, primary lymphatic structure. And thymus is a really interesting organ. It is located, if you look at you see the child's thymus and an adult's thymus. It is located kind of over the aortic arch in a child, and then kind of on top of the aortic arch in an adult. So one big difference between a child's thymus and an adult's thymus is that in a child, the thymus is much larger. Thymus is a bilobed organ, so it has two lobes. And again, it's responsible for maturation of T lymphocytes. Thymus will continue to get larger. It continues to grow until puberty. And then during puberty, it's going to undergo a process known as involution. So it's not evolution, but it's involution. And so what involution means, that it means that there is a decrease in immune, or not decrease in immune. It's going to decrease in size, but also internally, the thymic tissue is being lost and replaced by adipose tissue. So not only the whole thing gets smaller, but internally there is loss of some thymic tissue as well. So that's what involution means. This involution is associated with a decreased immune response in older individuals. So you have smaller thymus and less thymic tissue. So our ability to form a new immune response to a new pathogen decreases because of that reason. So it's most active in children because that's when we are kids, that's when we are exposed to most pathogens. And so we build our immunity, in that time during puberty. So you can see the micrograph of a child's thymus, and that's all thymic tissue, all that purple, pink stuff, that's all thymic tissue. You see a capsule there, that's would be probably a lobe of the thymus, and you can see the darker area, that's the cortex of a thymic lobule, and then the lighter area, that's your medulla of each lobule. So thymus as a whole organ is not split into cortex and medulla. So recall like adrenal gland. It had the whole organ had the cortex, and then the center of that gland was a medulla. In thymus, when we talk about cortex and medulla, we're talking about cortex of each lobule, not a lobe. And so on the adult's thymus, you can see that a little better. You can just see a few of the individual lobules surrounded by adipose tissue. Each thymic lobule has that dark edge and a lighter center. That dark edge is the cortex of the thymic lobule. The lighter edge is the medulla of the thymic lobule. All that white stuff or that light pink stuff that's around these thymic lobules, that's adipose tissue that replaced thymic tissue in an adult's thymus. Okay, so that's our thymus. And that's that for the primary lymphatic structures. Let's look at the secondary lymphatic structures. So we'll talk a little more about those. Secondary lymphatic structures, their function is to house lymphocytes and other immune cells. So primary lymphatic structures, their primary function was formation and maturation of lymphocytes. Secondary lymphatic structures house lymphocytes. Okay, so that's where these lymphocytes like to be. If you recall, when we talked about blood, And we looked at the composition of blood, like what you have erythrocytes, you have buffy coat, and you have plasma. Buffy coat is where you found your immune cells, your leukocytes. It was a very small portion of blood. It was about 1% or less of whole blood. And that's normal. That this is because this doesn't mean that that's all the lymphocytes that you have in your body. It just means that's their normal concentration in blood. Most of your lymphocytes are going to be found in these secondary lymphatic structures. They're going to be found other places. So blood is mostly just kind of for them to move wherever they're trying to go, but they're mostly found in the secondary lymphatic structures. So the first lymphatic, we can divide the secondary lymphatic structures into two subcategories, and they are lymphatic organs or lymphatic nodules. Lymphatic organs are things that have a complete capsule, and they include lymph node and spleen. So for secondary lymphatic structures, you could almost write like a little flow chart, right? Sorry about that. The lymphatic nodules are not going to have a capsule. So these are going to have either incomplete or completely absent capsule. They're just literally going to be like just a nodule that you see inside of the lymph node, but it's not going to be inside of the lymph node. It's just going to be somewhere on its own. Okay. It's going to look the same. It's going to have kind of the same cells present. It's just not in the lymph node. So that's what lymphatic nodules would be. And lymphatic nodules are going to include your tonsils, your MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and also diffuse lymphatic nodules, just without a name. So we'll look at those in a little bit. But let's go ahead and begin with the lymph node. The lymph node, there's quite a bit of anatomy here that you need to be aware of. Lymph node is divided into cortex and medulla. Their sizes can vary. So some of the smallest lymph nodes are only like 2 millimeters small. I don't want to say large, but small. So 2 millimeters is very, very small. If you have a ruler with a metric, with centimeters, it will be 2 of those little marks. Okay, that's 2 millimeters. But some of the larger lymph nodes are up to 1 inch long, so they can really vary in size. There is that cortex and the medulla. The cortex is that purple and pink area that has the lymphatic nodules in it. And then the medulla is that purple yellowish area on that picture. And you don't have lymphatic nodules in the medulla, but what you do have is you have medullary cords in there with certain cells. So there are also some vessels that are associated with this. So you can see that there are several vessels that are attached to the lymph node on that that outer curvature, right? And these vessels are bringing lymph to the lymph node. These are known as the afferent, okay, afferent, but I say afferent to make sure that you know that it begins with an A vessels, and these are going to bring lymph from various places into the lymph node. The lymph will flow between and around the lymphatic nodules through the cortical sinuses. Okay, sinus is a space, right? So it will flow through the cortical sinus towards the medulla and flow and surround the medullary cords. And then eventually the lymph will exit through an efferent lymphatic vessel. And usually there is only one efferent lymphatic vessel. Sometimes there might be 2. That can happen, but usually mostly lymph nodes are going to have just one efferent lymphatic vessel, while it has a lot of afferent lymphatic vessels. And you see that there is a capsule on this. I've mentioned that this is an organ, so it would have a complete capsule here. Let's look at the cortex, at the lymphatic nodule, and you see that in that box that says cortex. So what we're looking there in that box is just a single lymphatic nodule. They made it nice and oval, regular looking inside of the lymph node. When you look at the lymph node picture, they don't look as even. But anyway, they are, in general, if you were to look under the microscope, they're going to look very kind of oval-ish looking. So you can see this lymphatic nodule here. There's a cortical sinus that they drew around this as well. That's where the lymph would be flowing through. And then the nodule itself has two distinct regions. It has a germinal center in the middle of the lymphatic nodule. That's that lighter part. So on the lymph node, you can see that sort of the pink area is lighter, and that's going to be your germinal center. And then there is a mantle zone that surrounds that. The germinal center is going to have your proliferating B lymphocytes. So let's say that this lymph node detects some kind of a pathogen. There's going to be a series of signals that are going to happen, and they're going to tell the B lymphocytes in that germinal center to start multiplying a certain way. And these are going to be specially designed B lymphocytes against that pathogen that has been detected. Again, a little more about that will be in chapter 22, but that's kind of where this is leading us. The mantle zone has T cells or T lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are cells that look like, they almost remind me like of a star or something like that. They have dendrites, they have those projections. Or if you think back to neuron, they kind of look like that too. But they don't look like neurons. Okay, just when you hear dendrites, that's kind of what I want you to imagine. The dendritic cells are good for detecting pathogens because they have those dendrites, so they can use those to trap anything foreign. And macrophages are your cleaning cells. So these are your universal garbage disposals. Macrophages like to eat things, and they don't really care what it is. They can eat pathogens, they can eat dead cells or infected cells, anything, debris, okay? Macrophages will destroy it all, okay? They're universal. And then you have T cells in that mantle zone as well. And T cells are going to be the cells that are going to initiate the immune response. So macrophages and dendritic cells are the detecting cells. They're the ones that can be like, okay, that's a pathogen. That should not be here. This is bad. We need to start fighting it. So they will send a message to T cell saying, hey, T cell, look what I found. And T cell will be like, oh, thank you for telling me. I'm going to send a message to B lymphocytes. And then B lymphocytes begin to proliferate. So that was a very simplified version of how the immune system works, but that's kind of how that goes. T cells cannot detect pathogen on their own, and that's why they rely on macrophages and dendritic cells. That's why you're usually going to see them together in places so that the macrophages and dendritic cells can pass on the message to the T cell. And then B cells are the cells that are going to produce your antibodies. These are the cells that are making the antibodies against the pathogens. So that's our cortex. If we look at the medulla, so the yellow box right there, the medulla has medullary cords and medullary sinus. So medullary cords are, just imagine them kind of like a series of fibers that are running through, and in those fibers you have immune cells kind of suspended within them. That's kind of what a medullary cord is. It's connective tissue with B cells and T cells and macrophages. And then the spaces between these medullary cords are medullary sinuses. And again, that's where the lymph is going to flow through. So as the lymph flows through, these macrophages trap foreign substances, and the B cells and T cells can come in contact with pathogens, and then they can initiate an immune response. Notice, you probably noticed, or maybe you didn't notice, but I think I said that the lymph nodes in your body are in clusters. So there's a cluster arrangement of lymph nodes throughout your body. And that is because you don't just want to run the lymph through one single lymph node and then send it off back to blood saying, oh, it's good. You're going to run the lymph through several different lymph nodes so that you're making sure that that fluid is clear, and you can stimulate multiple lymph nodes to initiate that immune response, to have those B lymphocytes proliferating. So it's better to have it go through several lymph nodes. Also, if you're exposed to something for the very first time, you only have a few cells that are actually able to recognize, wait a minute, that's not supposed to be here, okay? So you have to also find the lymph node with the right lymphocyte that is able to tell that something is not supposed to be there and initiate the immune response against it. If you get exposed to something the second time, then you're already going to have a lot of cells that know of that pathogen. So that's going to be different. But again, that's more of a chapter 22 thing. So that's our lymph node. And you can see the micrograph there. So at the bottom, the microscope slide. So notice that it looks like little ovals or circles along the outer edge of that. Those are those lymphatic nodules, okay, on that micrograph. Okay, the next thing I will talk about is the spleen, and spleen is our next secondary lymphatic organ. Spleen does have a capsule, and it's our largest lymphatic organ. A lot of times, like I used to have this quiz, and I had this question, and I said, which of the following does not belong into lymphatic system? And spleen was one of the options, but then the other thing was like, obviously that's not the correct answer. Okay, spleen belongs into lymphatic system. The question was what didn't belong into lymphatic system, and I had like, I don't know, lungs or something something random. People would always, like, there's so many people that would pick spleen as not part of lymphatic system. I don't know why. Spleen is your lymphatic organ, so it definitely belongs into lymphatic system. Spleen is going to, however, filter your blood. So how lymph nodes filtered lymph, spleen will filter blood. Okay, so remember that difference. Okay, so lymph node filters lymph, spleen filters blood. Spleen is located in your upper left quadrant of the body. It's kind of, you can actually see the pancreas right here. The pancreas, the tail of the pancreas would be touching the spleen, okay? And it kind of goes along the side of your body like that. Well, you can't see that, but it's kind of a curved organ there. Spleen is supplied by and drained by splenic vessels, so splenic artery, splenic vein, and there's no cortex and medulla. Okay, spleen does not have cortex and medulla. Spleen has red and white pulp. Okay, so make a note of that. There's no cortex and medulla. There is red and white pulp. The white pulp is going to contain your B cells and T cells, as well as macrophages. These are going to be responsible for destruction of pathogens and also production of antibodies if we're talking about the B lymphocytes specifically. The red pulp is going to contain erythrocytes, platelets that are being recycled. Platelets are actually stored in the spleen. Spleen is your largest reservoir of platelets. So about 30% of your body platelets are actually stored in the spleen. And then erythrocytes get recycled in the spleen. So they're in the red pulp there as well. You would also see macrophages and B cells in the red pulp as well. And you would be recycling the worn out erythrocytes in the red pulp. So since spleen filters blood, the blood flow through the spleen is very important. So blood comes into the spleen through that splenic artery, then it will branch into smaller and smaller arteries, and ultimately you're going to have what we call a central artery, and this central artery will run through the white pulp. Okay, so you can see on the diagram there on part image C on your screen, there is the kind of the whitish oval. That's your white pulp. Okay, and then you would have a central artery running through it. Under the microscope, you're most likely not going to see it like this, because that would assume that the artery is completely straight, and we know things are 3D and probably not completely straight. So under the microscope, you usually would just see a cross section of the central artery instead of like lengthwise cut of that central artery. And if you look very closely at this, let me see, where's my little pen here? I'm gonna try to show you where it is, but right, like right there. That little tiny circle that you see there, that would be the central artery. So it's very small. And ultimately the central artery, I mean, it's going to empty into sinuses, so, or sinusoids actually. So that's that. Okay, so you have the central artery. Central artery will branch into smaller arterioles, and ultimately these arterioles will empty into sinusoids that are surrounding the white pulp. In these sinusoids, so remember when I told you that when we first mentioned sinusoids, I said when we look at spleen, sinusoid is not even going to really look like a vessel, it's going to look more like a space. Look at this. Those blue areas, those are your sinusoids. They don't look like blood vessels anymore, right? They don't look like capillaries. So blood will flow through these sinusoids. Erythrocytes worn out, erythrocytes will exit the blood, they will be recycled. And then any pathogens that are there would be detected. Hopefully, that's kind of the goal by the immune system cells. And then the blood would drain into a venule. And then ultimately, venules would merge into larger and larger veins. And then blood exits the spleen through splenic vein. So that's kind of how the blood flow through the spleen works. Okay, so you have a splenic artery, smaller and smaller arteries, central artery. Then from central artery in the white pulp, it will exit into the sinusoids surrounding the white pulp, and then venules, veins, larger veins, and then splenic vein is the last one. So that's how the blood flow goes through the spleen. Don't forget, spleen is a lymphatic structure, so we want it to feel included. Okay, why is that little arrow still there? Hold on. I'm actually not going to play this. I'll let you watch that on your own. Hold on, I'm still in annotating mode. Okay, so there's a little video that talks about a topic in the immune system that I'd like you to watch, but I'm not going to take up your time with that right now. So it's in if you enter the Nearpod in the recordings folder, you will have that link to the video. Because we're almost done here, so I don't want to keep you too long. Tonsils are your secondary lymphatic nodules. We don't call these organs because they don't have a complete capsule. They do have a partial capsule on the exposed part, but then wherever they're attached to your body, then the capsule doesn't go underneath that, so it's not a complete capsule. Tonsils protect you from things that you might inhale or ingest. They are located in the pharynx. You can actually see your palatine tonsils if after we're done, go to the bathroom, look in the mirror, open your mouth, and you should be able to see your tonsils even if they're not swollen. If you're sick and your throat hurts and they're swollen, you can really see them there if you still have them, right? But they are protecting us from those palatine tonsils, mostly from things that we would ingest. You have pharyngeal tonsils that are close to the opening of the auditory tube there. And these would be mostly for things that you're inhaling. There's no food that goes up there normally. Okay, not saying that food cannot go up there into that nasopharynx, but normally food doesn't go there. So that one is going to be mostly for inhaled things or against inhaled pathogens. And then lingual tonsil would be for both. Lingual tonsil is on the posterior surface of your tongue. So that whole thing right there is your tongue. Lingual tonsil, that prefix has to do with tongue, right? Lingual. So that's, and notice that you see the lymphatic nodules. Again, there's a darker edge and a lighter center, a lighter germinal center, just like what we saw inside of the lymph node. This is just not inside of the lymph node, okay? But it's still somewhat organized into this tonsil structure. We have areas in our body that are even more diffuse than this, that are really not a structure at all. Well, I don't want to say not the structure at all. It is a structure. They're just not kind of in like those nodules like that. Let's see. Let's do this. So do you remember what is what? Just a little quick review. That was easy, wasn't it? All right, yeah, so that should have been fairly easy. This is actually my last slide here, but the last thing that I want to talk about is hold on, where am I? Is the mold, okay? And mold is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Actually, some people actually say that tonsils are a type of mold or mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue as well. It's just in our textbook. We are talking about it separately. The mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue is found in several places where there's mucosa that it's usually open to the exterior, such as you might be looking at the lamina propria of the mucosa in the GI tract, respiratory tract, urinary tract, genital tract, okay, areas like this. The mold is very, very prominent in your ileum, and ileum is your part of your small intestine. And this is because this is a site where you're absorbing things into your body. And so having these nodules in there is going to help prevent things entering your body that you don't want to, right? In the ileum, these nodules are known as the Peyer patches, Peyer patches, with a capital P because it's named after the guy that discovered them. So Peyer patches. You do have a lot of lymphatic tissue in the large intestine as well, and other places, but only in the small intestine, the ileum, is where we call it the Peyer patches. So that's molt. And that's it for chapter 21. So look, it was under an hour.